I'd like to introduce to you all Simon Cribb, who's come a long way from Western Australia also, and he works as a physiotherapist amongst many other things, and he uses colour and light and other applications in very interesting ways. So your topic today is Light is Life. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you very much. The topic came about because Manisha asked me to say what I was going to talk about, and I couldn't really think, so I thought, keep it general. So yes, I've been a physiotherapist since 1987, and I've used light therapy in my practice for at least 25 years. Started with low-level laser therapy, cold laser as they call it. Moved on to colour puncture without leaving laser behind. Incorporated spectrochrome, again without leaving the other modalities behind. And I incorporate these modalities with a lot of other things. The way I work probably resembles somewhat what Simon too does. So there's a philosophical background to it as well. But I'm not going to go so much into that as the theory behind light. I'll try and keep it light for you, but what I really wanted to talk about was Fritz Albert Popp and his Biophoton Theory. It's an absolute foundation stone. It's remained marginalised as a theory, but if you're a light therapist, it explains so much that it's indispensable. I love it, so I thought, well, let's give Fritz Albert an airing. And simultaneously, the idea keeps occurring, well, light as a therapeutic modality has fallen through the cracks. I'm the only therapist I know who uses light in his practice, physiotherapist. So why? So I thought, well, let's probe around that little idea too. And there's a little quote from St. Leonard. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Yes. God bless him. Oh, God bless you, Leonard. Okay, so just starting with some of the dry information first is it's been an absolute pleasure to use light in physiotherapy practice. It's been so natural, and the features I've noticed is that it gives you a very rapid change in physiology. What that means is if someone's tense and you want to, make some sort of mechanical adjustment, you need them to relax, light will do it much faster than any other form of intervention. It gives favourable and consistent results, so in most instances it works. And its compatibility is universal, so I use light a lot with people who are on heavy drug therapies, so I work in cancer support and I work in multiple sclerosis and autoimmune disorders. They're all attached to the methotrexate and things. The light therapy doesn't cause a conflict. Surprisingly, because you'd think if you're toxing and detoxing your liver simultaneously there'd be a problem, but I've just found it works really well. And it works for a huge variety of conditions, and I've just listed a few of those there, just to give an idea of the scope of light therapy. Pain, it's a no-brainer. People relax so long as you've got the frequency right. Yeah? Emotional upheaval and stress, much overlooked, but of course behind every pain there's a story, and it's one of emotional upheaval and stress. So light works as well for a broken heart as it does for a broken bone. Immune situations, acute infections, it works really well. I don't know if I should flesh this out with stories, but I'm a little bit tempted to, after Simon's fantastic storytelling, to slot in the odd one. I had a little lass who, 3-year-old, and her mum brought her to me with chronic ear infections, which she'd had all her life. Her retromolar lymphatics were very swollen, and she was very tender over the upper third of the breastbone, which is the thymus. So it's a sign of an immune condition, kind of, steaming away. I used light with her, and I used crystals with her, bloodstone in this case. Bloodstone's a dark green stone, which has a very strong anti-infective action, works very well if you have a cold or something. I taped it to her thymus. And Mum said, well, what do we do? And I said, don't worry, she'll tell you when she's ready. 3 days later, I got a text from Mum saying her ear infections have gone away. but she won't take the stone off. And I said, don't worry, she'll tell you. Another 2 days and another text arrives and she said, Mummy, I'm ready for the stone to come off today. That was all great. Her ear infections seemed to have cleared up. Then something like a week later, another text saying she's got a tummy ache and she wants the stone. Now, there's a structure in the gut called the cistern chyli. And the cistern chyli is kind of the lymphatic brain for the gut. I could go a lot into cistern chyli, I won't bore you too much, okay. But it swells up when there's a lymphatic stress. And it's kind of like what the thymus is for the upper body immune system, the cistern chyli, spleen, and the connections between it are for that. So what I was hearing there is, maybe that was it. So I said, well, let her go with it. And she did, and they taped the stone on her tummy, and her tummy stopped aching. And as far as I'm aware, she's been fine ever since. So it's so simple. And the reason I'm telling this story is because it's so simple. The child knows what to do, but for an adult, not so easy. We get very caught up in the conversation, you know. And I'm going to talk a lot about the conversations. Wound healing, yeah, you know, that's well established. You can use lasers and things and you can accelerate tissue growth, and it's just, nobody's going to argue about that one. Chronic tiredness, chronic fatigue, see it all the time, responds really well. Just, you have to know a thing or two. I particularly like the work with autoimmune disorders because it works so flawlessly. So another little flesh it out anecdote, okay. A woman who came with rheumatoid arthritis, a 15-year history. She hadn't worked for 15 years. In my clinical opinion, what I was finding was gross disturbance of the spleen. And the resonant frequency, since we're talking a little bit about frequencies, was turquoise. Now turquoise, in my understanding, which probably comes a bit from spectrochrome, a bit from Peter Mandel, is for acute situations. So here we have an immune system that for 20 years, or whatever it's been, has been in an acute state. I kind of like that interpretation because medically we talk about autoimmune diseases being the immune system attacking the body. No. Okay? It's the immune system that's been turned on and nothing's turned it off. That's just, you know, my hypothesis. The what was turning it on for this woman, just to cut a long story short, was bullying. She's a lovely lady, very, very polite, very kind to everybody. People would dump on her. And this, should I go non-scientific here? I'm going to. This is a shift of the third chakra, which is the ego, the sense of me. And she was always putting her own needs aside, letting other people impose their reality on her. Long story short, we used crystals, we used light. The blood test came right. This is the relevant thing, okay? So her immune factors came down, and they've remained down. She's gone back to work. She's been back at work a year and a half, 2 years now. She went back to real estate, for heaven's sake, where people bully you. You know, like it's a feral game, and this little lightweight blonde lady, they dump on her, but she's learned to draw boundaries. And I said, well, why are you going there? And she said, I feel I need the test. And so for her, it became about holding her own ground. Anyway, she's well. That's a long story short. So these are some of the things it can be used for. And I particularly like it in cancer support. This is not fixing the cancer. So my clients include a number of people who are in late stage cancer, just a handful, you know, because I have to be getting on with the doctor on the same wavelength, and there's not many doctors who are going to kind of agree with me here. But they can be riddled. So I had a recent example of a lady she had cancer in her lungs. It started in the bone of her hip. They'd taken the cancer out of her hip. Her leg wasn't working. She's on a quad cane. She was dying fast. Clinically, what that looked like, this was the problem, was her haemoglobin had crashed. And they were measuring her blood once a week and it was going down, down, down. Now, good haemoglobin somewhere in the kind of low hundreds, I think, for a normal range. Hers was somewhere around 80. It was getting critical. We used basically a combination of orange frequencies on the spleen, on the liver. Well, this kind of balancing these two organs, two filters, we might get to that, I doubt it. And anyway, her hemoglobin picked up, her energy picked up, her happiness to be alive picked up. She started going caravanning with her husband. She's actually okay. She had lung cancer, it was causing shoulder pain. solved it by, once I realised the shoulder pain was a lung pain, which took me a little while, solved it by treating the lung with orange frequencies. Carnelian was the stone. You can tape it on and it keeps acting. And so that's the kind of stuff I like to do. The domain I like to play in, which, work should be play. So, logically speaking, it's got so many advantages. It's got so much going for it. Simple to apply, clinically effective, for me anyway. It's cost effective for the client and practitioner. It's very simple to buy equipment if you can find it. It's completely safe with visual light. Lasers, of course, they're safe so long as you understand contraindications and you don't overdose people. It's gentle, respectful, non-invasive, so why wouldn't you use it? And yet here I am, the only colour physiotherapist in Australia that I'm aware of. And a few of them are using lasers, and they're mostly people who've had something to do with me anyway. So it's why is it so marginalised? So those questions were there for me when I came to this presentation. And looking back on the record, well, from about, let's say, Babish onwards, people have been reporting successful outcomes with light therapy for 100 years. You'd think it would have a bit of traction, wouldn't you? So why has the uptake been so erratic? Why is there so little published research? And why is it so hard to get colour therapy equipment and find practitioners? So I'd like to kind of address that, but just to not make it too dry, let's do it as a story. So this is a story of discovery and amazing wonders. And like many good stories, it's got its ups and its downs. It's got its trials. And it's the story of Fritz Albert Popp and how he set out to radically transform our understanding of the quantum world of photobiology with Biophoton Theory. So this is a platform that he produced, and Peter Mandel constructed his colour puncher on this. Samasati, I think, has roots in the same body of theory. I like it because it's a model that lends credibility. It makes sense of light therapies. And it's profoundly influenced my understanding of what happens when we shine a light upon someone. So here's the gentleman himself. We know today that man is essentially a being of light. A modern science of photobiology is presently proving this. In terms of healing, the implications are immense. We now know, for example, that light can initiate or arrest cascade-like reactions in the cells, and that genetic cellular damage can be virtually repaired within hours by faint beams of light. We're still on the threshold of fully understanding the complex relationship between light and life. But we can now say emphatically that the function of our entire metabolism is dependent on light. So this sweepingly optimistic statement came from his book, I think you'd pronounce it Biologisches Delikt or something. It's German, it's not been translated. It was probably written in the late 70s. And things didn't quite go according to plan for Fritz Albert Popp, okay? But what he discovered is remarkable. So we're going to wind back the clock to where the whole biophoton idea started from. A gentleman called Alexander Gurwitch in 1922. So Alexander was observing the cell production, mitosis, of onion stalks. And he noticed that new cellular divisions started as soon as the roots of another onion approached the first onion. Now, at the time, the popular theory was the regulation of cell growth was the responsibility of chemical messengers. But Gurwitch suspected otherwise. He had observed low-level luminescence in living tissue, and he coined the word biophotons. And he thought that cellular communication might be modulated by light. To test his idea, this came from a German website, by the way, so my description might be a little hazy. He separated onion roots with glass. And essentially what he found is that when the onion roots were separated with ordinary glass, no mitosis occurred. So it could be chemical still. But then he separated it with crystal glass, which allows for the transmission of ultraviolet light. And the mitosis was stimulated, in his opinion. So he was pretty excited about this, and he deduced that ultraviolet light acting through, and he coined the word formative field, which you may recognise from other people, had a big role to play in cellular communication and reproduction. But he didn't have proof. And there were many attempts made to replicate his experiment, and most of them failed. So he was marginalised, and mainstream inquiry took off in the direction of genetics. And so he just remained as a footnote, you might say. Until, our protagonist comes along. So in 1970, Fritz Albert Popp was working at the University of Mainz, and he's examining benzoapyrene, which is a polycyclic hydrocarbon. It's a carcinogen that's found in cigarette smoke and barbecue smoke and tar, all that sort of thing. And he was shining ultraviolet light upon it. And what he observed was that light was absorbed by the chemical and then re-emitted at a different frequency. He was a little surprised. He repeated the experiment with benzoepyrene, also a polycyclic hydrocarbon, but non-carcinogenic. It absorbed the light and re-emitted it at the same frequency. So what's going on here? So he's wondering if light scrambling could be a common property of carcinogens. So in this series of experiments, he went on to observe 37 other chemicals, and he found he could predict which were carcinogenic because they were all light scramblers. And there was another strange property that struck him, is the light source he was using was ultraviolet 380 nanometers. Other frequencies are unaffected, but this frequency was not. So he was starting to think, well, could this have a role to play in cancer? And in his back reading on the subject, he came across this phenomenon of photorepair. And it's well known, well documented. If you cook a cell with ultraviolet light and destroy 99% of the cell body, including the DNA, you can regenerate the same cell in the same 24 hours by subjecting it to a continuous bathing of a very weak frequency of the light used to damage it. We're talking about ideal dosage of light, okay? So the cell will repair within a day. And photorepair goes on in all of us all the time. We're damaged by the sun and we repair, and we don't have to sit under a light to do this. Except, I've put there, people with xeroderma pigmentosa, which is a genetic condition. They don't photorepair, they die of skin cancer at a young age. Now what struck Fritz Albert here was that the optimal frequency of the photorepair was 380 nanometers. Too much to be a coincidence. So if carcinogens cause cancer by permanently blocking the wavelengths that causes photorepair, there must be a source of light within living tissue that facilitates repair. Now this was a radical idea at the time. He's saying that humans emit light. So he wrote up his findings, and they were accepted by a prestigious cancer journal, and he felt himself well on the way to a cure to cancer. His science was unassailable, except for one problem. It assumed that there was a weak light of 380 nanometers being emitted somewhere in the human being. A majority opinion was not pretty, okay? Basically they said, don't you think if there was a light in the body someone would have noticed by now? Go and prove it. And of course Fritz said, well, fair enough, he's a scientist, I'll prove it to you, but I need the right equipment. And then it didn't go on, nothing much progressed for a couple of years, until he met a gentleman called Bernhard Ruth. Bernhard, is that? Bernhard? I don't know. Anyway, who approached him asking Popp to supervise his PhD dissertation. And Popp said to Ruth, well, if you can prove to me there's a source of light in the human body, you can have your PhD. And Ruth said, that's ridiculous. There's no source of light in the human body. And Fritz said, well, fine. Prove there's no source of light in the human body and you can have your PhD. Now, he was on to something here because Ruth was an outstanding experimental physicist. And he built this contraption, took him 2 years at least, which is a photomultiplier. Excuse my primitive science if you know a little more about this than me, but basically an electron is converted into, a photon is converted into an electron when it hits the device, and then that electron is amplified by a series of voltage dropping resistors, and you can end up taking a picture, a photograph of the photon, but as a spray of light. They're widely used in experimental physics, and they're still used to this day. Now, what they decided to do was start with seedlings. And so they placed seedlings in a dark chamber, and I've got this is something like what it looked like. It's not the original equipment, but something like it. And so this little hatch at the front here, let's get with the technology, is a little compartment, and they could put the seedlings in there and leave them for a number of hours, and then they could record the results. And of course you've all seen the photographs. They came out with photos with these sprays, massive sprays of light coming off the seedlings. Now this was experimental physics, so they were sceptical, okay? And the scepticism was, well, surely it's got something to do with photosynthesis and chlorophyll. So they tried subtracting that from the equation, so they grew potato seedlings in the dark without exposure to any light whatsoever. And then they put them in the photomultiplier, and the potatoes were exuding even more photons than the cucumber seedlings. So the light wasn't coming from an external source. Here's this is someone else's experiment showing roughly the procedure. Okay, so you chop up the plant, put it in a petri dish. Don't add the herbicide, this is a different experiment, okay? Put it in the photomultiplier, wait, analyse the results. Simple enough. So Popp was at the point of saying confidently, light emission is an essential part of life process. Living tissue emits light. And there were two things that are absolutely crucial to the understanding here. The photon emissions in living matter are periodic and display a very high degree of coherence. Coherence is the one key concept we want to dwell a little bit on. So Popp adopted Gerswich's term biophotons to describe light that is being emitted by living tissue. It's periodic, so it's rhythmic, and it has a high degree of order. So that is that the light has very stable intensity and rhythm without the fluctuations you observe in normal ambient light. He states somewhere that the best lasers we own can produce a coherent beam for about 1/10 of a second, but human biorhythms will produce a coherent state for days, weeks, or even months. So, what's coherence? Here's a definition straight out of Wikipedia for you, which we know is the great font of all things wise. So, biophoton coherence, a fixed relationship between the phase of waves in a beam of radiation of a single frequency. So for single frequency, read blue, for instance, okay? And the waves fall into a rhythm. They don't have to match, okay? But they fall into a rhythm. So the two beams of light are coherent when the phase difference between their waves is constant. They're non-coherent if there's a random or changing phase relationship. That's all right, isn't it? So here's my little illustration of coherence and non-coherence. So with coherent communication at least, there's a low output of energy and a high degree of order to get your result. With incoherent communication, love it, there's a high energy cost and the wavelengths are chaotic. There's no apparent order. Still gets a result, just takes more energy, I guess. People are still reeling. Okay, so here's the critical point. Coherence enables interference. And there are two types of interference. Constructive interference, which amplifies a signal. So if you have two wavelengths that are matching, you get a bigger wave. Now, in my opinion, when Simon number 2 was talking about, well, you feel a pulsation, what you're feeling is coherence setting into the system. Okay, so you'll feel the resonance coming off the person when there's a coherent message being received. And the critical thing with light therapy is it only takes a message. You know how Fritz Albert Popp was saying, a cascade of reactions. You only have to initiate a message for the whole message to keep going, keep rolling. You don't have to keep putting energy into the same thing. I digress. Okay, so destructive interference is turning off a signal. Now, for colour therapists here, if you're using a cool frequency, you're most likely creating destructive interference of a warm frequency, so you're sedating. You know, in acupuncture terms, you stimulate or you sedate. So warm frequencies will stimulate, cool frequencies will sedate. Warm frequencies are constructive interference, cool frequencies destructive interference. My interpretation. That's my little memory prompt for constructive interference. Okay, so when the orchestra's tuning up, that people are playing at different rhythms and different frequencies, there's no discernible pattern. A lot of noise, a lot of energy, no pattern. When they start playing, they're all playing in harmony. So they're all playing in coherent wavelengths that then add to one another, and the overall message is very clear. Yeah? Good enough metaphor? And destructive interference is when one wavelength cancels out another, or a wave cancels itself out. So here we have a wave hitting the seawall, and you get a flat spot as the wave reflects back on itself and cancels itself out. So it's turning off the wavelength. So back to Fritz Albert. This comes from one of his papers, and I can't pretend to understand some of his papers, okay, but it's very clear. If it's possible to show evidence of an extraordinary high degree of coherence of biophotons, then the conclusion follows that this universal phenomenon of biological systems is responsible for information transfer within and between cells. Answering then the crucial question of intra- and extracellular biocommunication, including the regulation of the metabolic activities of cells, as well as of the growth and differentiation, and even of evolutionary development. Big claim. Hard to digest in one reading. He's saying light is information, not just energy. So just to review where we've been so far, just to keep it coherent. So his process at this stage, he'd established that there's a source of light in living tissue that's involved in tissue repair. He's calling that source of light biophotons, and biophotons are coherent and rhythmic as opposed to non-coherent light, normal ambient light. Okay? And when things are coherent, they can create patterns of interference, so they can be used to turn on and off signals. And he's saying that cellular communication has much to do with this, as opposed to the chemical model that was the dominant model at the time, which it was all turned on and off by hormones, etc. So, just to paint the broader picture, and these parts are not in dispute, okay? The main source of light on Earth is the sun. You know, geothermal radiation, but the sun basically. Sunlight provides the energy that green plants use to create sugars, which release energy into living things that digest them. All straightforward, okay? So this is the process of photosynthesis, and it provides virtually all the energy used by living things on Earth. Now that's all good. Now Popp is theorising that when we eat plant food, we liberate the photons trapped in the food. So energy, photons, interchangeable terms. And we store them for our own purposes. So the light that we absorb and liberate from food gets reprocessed and used as biophoton emissions. So he used the light as a signalling system. So what was previously thought of as just heat, the random byproduct of metabolism, Popp was saying this is coherent information, and it's the driving force for all molecular processes of life. So he's close to answering the challenge that had been laid down to him, but he still needed to identify the source of the light emissions. DNA. So he and his team were aware that if you subject DNA to a chemical called ethidium bromide, it denatures the DNA, unwinds it. What would happen if we observed that in a photomultiplier? So they did just that. And the observation was that when the bonded pairs of DNA were separated, there was a release of light. And the light was coherent and in a large range of frequencies. So it wasn't just heat, it wasn't just infrared, it was every frequency up to ultraviolet. So in my layman's understanding, what holds the chemical bonds together is basically energy. So if you're going to separate the bonds, the energy has to be released, has to go somewhere. And so what Popp was seeing here was energy coming out of the DNA. But what he was claiming, of course, was that this is much more than energy, this is information. Now he was zeroing in on the holy cow of science here, by the way, so things got a little trickier. But this was the thing that struck him the most. If you read the basic model of DNA, and it was brilliant in its time, nothing to detract from it. Roughly, that DNA, you know this, so I'll just do it in basic form. It's coiled up in the nucleus, and it is very, very long, and so it's coiled up very tight in the nucleus. And when it reproduces, it separates, and RNA comes along and makes a copy of a certain segment of the DNA, goes outside the nucleus. It's kind of read by the ribosome, which is one of the organelles in the cell. We could probably see one there, but I don't know which. Probably the little round ones. And the ribosome recruits amino acids and makes proteins. It works. It's good theory, okay? But what Popp was saying was, well, a cell performs 100,000 chemical reactions per second. For this to occur, the timing has to be exquisite. Chemistry itself is too slow to explain that. The coordination of this process has to happen at the speed of light. Therefore, he was proposing that coherent photon emissions from the DNA were the metronome for the whole of the cellular process. He was touching on a blind spot in scientific theory. Nobody else had an explanation for the timing of life process. They could say how the building blocks were delivered to the building site, but they couldn't say how the building was built, borrowing from Rupert Sheldrake there. Okay. Now, he was on a roll, okay, so he kept publishing things. People kept looking askance, and he was going a little too fast, perhaps, for the rate this could be assimilated. So I just wanted to mention a couple of his other discoveries. He noticed that all living organisms emit a continuous stream of light, okay? And the density of the photons is inversely proportional to the organism's level of evolution. That means a carrot floods out heaps of light, human being relatively little light, less than other organisms. There's a reason for that. I'll come to it. He is also observing a phenomenon known as delayed luminescence. So that is that a cell will absorb light, and then there's an interval, and then it re-emits the light, but it can change the frequency. And he felt this was evidence of intercellular communication. The light is a signal, it's received. When the cell wants that signal turned off, it re-emits another light. And they observed at least one experiment where they shone blue light upon a cell. They shone red light upon a cell. After an interval, it emitted blue light. And that's not a reflection, and it's not even the opposite, which is green, of course. It's a different message entirely. So he was looking at the information content going on at this microscopic level. So, The next phase, they built a total light excluding chamber big enough to put a human being in. So it was a room so dark that they could put their photon counter in there and record zero, zilch, no light. He took a healthy subject, and for 9 months, 27-year-old woman, she sat in the photo chamber for a period of time each day. I better catch up with my notes here. And something interesting emerged. He was measuring the light off her palms of her hand and her forehead, and he observed repeating patterns. So at cycles of a day, or a week, or a month, essentially the same pattern was showing up again and again. And so he was looking at biorhythms in vivo. That this, the first Simon was showing you about the biorhythms that light causes, and Popp was seeing this. He then went on to study patients in ill health. So once he had seen this in good health, and cancer patients had lost their rhythm and coherence. The light was patchy and glitchy and deficient. They were emitting less light. MS patients were emitting too much light. He described them as drowning in light. And he described their coherence, interestingly, as too rigid. So too caught up in one pattern. Now, from observing a number of subjects, they basically concluded that ill health is a state where the coherence of light breaks down and the waves are out of sync. Here's a picture cannibalised from a Japanese site, and this is a martial artist in the total dark chamber. And the basic point of this, as I could understand Japanese, which is not much, was that he can recruit his chi, and when he does, when he focuses his energy, he lights up like a candle. So the blue, you can see the photon density is the blue is lower density and red is high density photon emissions. Notice how around the subject there's a whole cloud of blue when he's in the chamber. So there's light around him, there's no other source of light except him. And then notice how when he focuses his will, he can emit a lot more photons. Cool. But they were gathering clouds. So Popp kept publishing stuff, people kept objecting, and the university he's working at started to feel the controversy was hurting their reputation. So his academic tenure came to the end of a contract and they terminated him. Not only that, but they attempted to confiscate his equipment, but he'd had a tip-off and he'd moved it all to a student's basement the day before. So he got away with his equipment, and they owed him 40,000 marks and they refused to pay him, and he took them to court, and life turned into a bit of a drama. He was in his mid-30s by this stage, he had a family to support, and suddenly he was unemployable. Now this is a prize-winning biophysicist, he had major prizes, he'd been top of his year all the way through everything, and he was unemployable all of a sudden. To cut a long story short, it took him about 25 years to regroup, and it was not to get accepted back into mainstream science, it was to gather a body of scientists around him. And scientists who accepted that cellular communication is a complex of rhythm and frequency rather than just chemical. And they call themselves the International Institute of Biophysics, and they've gone on to do a lot of interesting studies, and probably the one that is most useful here is they've gone on to study light emissions between species. And so a colony of water fleas exchanges photons, as do flowers and bacteria. There's photons zipping between them, and then they're being stored and they're being re-emitted. There's an apparent communication network between beings. And I'm sure for those of you working in the field of light, you feel it. Makes sense, yeah? That we're actually receiving wavelengths, and because they're coherent, you don't have to be able to see them. Do you know what I mean? They're just very organised information, sufficient to give you information that you then respond to. So, communication loop. So this brought him all the way back to Alexander Gurevich and his original idea that cellular communication was somehow modulated by light. It's apparently so. But biophoton theory is marginalised. Okay, it's not part of the mainstream. And chemical explanation remains the preferred metaphor. Now that's somewhat of a repeating theme. So I found this. You've probably been following Manisha's Facebook feed, the Australasian Light Association Facebook feed, and this article came up. It was written last month. So here's a scientist working, where's my notes? Professor Mark Wainwright at the John Moores University in Liverpool. And he's taken an old theory of using dyes to fight bacteria. So this was so before antibiotics were discovered. In the First World War, they would paint wounds with coloured dyes and it would apparently keep the infection at bay. He's done a lot of work in the laboratory and he's added light to the equation. And what he says basically is when you shine light upon dye, it creates reactive oxygen emission. So it floods the wound with oxygen, and it just happens that bacteria and viruses and various simple organisms are anaerobic. They can't tolerate oxygen. And they can't adapt to this either. Okay, so this is an era where antibiotic resistance is a huge problem. There's a lot of resistant bugs. There's very few antibiotics. And Mark Wainwright has got a solution, he feels, at least for some of it. Okay? And so to quote from him, why isn't this being used widely? This new approach is able to treat antibiotic-resistant and dangerous bacteria, such as MRSA, so surely this must appeal to those overseeing our defences against the threat of antibiotic resistance. Apparently not. Despite many attempts to interest governments, healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, those of us working in this field usually receive no response. The reasons for this are unknown.
Wow.
Okay, so just in case you think I'm telling a 50-year-old story, it's still the case, okay, that there's apparent resistance to the ideas of light. So let's go a little bit down that road now. We'll leave Fritz Albert Popp behind. And I'd like to talk a little bit about vitalism versus mechanism. So this is a 200-year-old distinction, okay? And the argument, basically, vitalism is the belief that living matter is animated by spirit. So the doctrine that life involves some immaterial vital force that cannot be explained scientifically. So, if you're talking about, and again, excuse me here while I just find what slide I'm on. So if you're talking about the body's energy, it's prana, chi, orgone, the breath of life, as in the Bible, meridians, chakras, and aura, that's vitalism. Okay? And in scientific circles, it's a discredited hypothesis or a pseudoscience. And it's considered to be a pejorative epithet. So you can dismiss something by calling it vitalism. All right? Now, versus the mechanistic viewpoint, the belief that all natural phenomenon can be explained by physical causes. Life is a machine and can be fully explained by chemistry. Now, the argument for mechanism, I'm not going to try and demolish the whole thing, okay, just to put you in a little bit of context here. It rests around research done in the 1820s, and there's one oft-quoted fellow called Friedrich Wöhler, and he succeeded in synthesising urea from ammonium cyanate. So he made organic compounds from non-organic ingredients. Therefore, if you can make organic matter from non-organic matter, they're the same thing. Fair enough. And they can't be different things. So life must be made from simpler chemical forms, therefore there is no spirit. So the assumption is that given the right combination of chemicals and enough billion years, life should emerge. Now, what I want to do is point out the strength of this distinction first. In 1828, this was a necessary distinction. But it's a distinction. We'll come back to that, okay? So if we're winding back the clock 200 years, we've got a world culture that's in transference from what we'd call mythic fundamentalism to scientific rationalism. So for a mythic fundamentalist, God determines what goes on and you follow the book and then you're okay. And if you don't do what God wants, then you're in trouble. Okay, so along came Galileo and Leonardo da Vinci and Nicholas Copernicus and they got into trouble. Well, Copernicus didn't because he died first, but you see, they were teaching things that were specifically prescribed against by the church. And so if science was going to progress, they had to get rid of God. They had to reduce the equation, okay, because you can't have, God says you can't dissect anatomy, therefore you can't, if you're going to learn, you've got to dissect anatomy. So people were claiming their right to think for themselves in the rational age, okay, the Enlightenment. And let's face it, the distinction works a treat. It's brilliant. If you look at life purely from a chemical perspective, it explains so much that before you know it, you've got the modern world. Haven't you? You've got flight and mobile phones and antibiotics and, all sorts of stuff, incredibly powerful stuff. Okay? The trouble is that it became a fact. Okay, so it went from being a hypothesis to a fact. In other words, it was a relative truth, but it became an absolute truth. And when things become absolute, they get enshrined, don't they? And suddenly you've got God back in the equation with a different name. Yeah? So when people are convinced that they know the absolute truth, they're unable to look from other perspectives. And that's kind of where we're coming to, okay? So going back to 1959 and Watson and Crick published the DNA theory, blew the world out, utterly blew us out, okay? And mechanism had peaked. 1970, when Fritz Albert Popp was experimenting, it was still the piece de resistance of scientific thought. This is how DNA works. But it became more than just a model. Because when you look up DNA on Google, you'll find the key to life itself. We understand how life works because of DNA. It can explain everything, okay? Bit of a problem. So what Popp was observing was at odds with this now enshrined theory. So essentially, Popp was saying, wait, there's more. And he was adding an additional layer of subtlety to scientific understanding. The astounding chemistry of life is timed and regulated by light emissions. To a biophysicist, it actually wasn't a mystery because when you shine a light on a chemical like it did in the first place, it creates a reaction. Light stimulates chemistry. I mean, they're inseparable. So he didn't think he was saying anything radical. But he was kicking the leg of this 200-year-old platform of understanding. Vitalism versus mechanism. And when you start to talk about humans emitting light, it's getting very close to humans containing vital energy. Yeah? And suddenly the door to vitalism's open again, and suddenly things that were concrete facts aren't facts anymore, and there's this great big yawning void. Okay, no clear line. And Popp seemed to be suggesting that life was organised by resonance and frequency emanating from the quantum void. Okay, so it was somewhere way beyond where chemistry could take us at the moment. So we come to the modern era, and let's just find out what slide I've got next. Yeah, that looks nice. Time for a little mental break, a little refreshment. So vitalism versus mechanism doesn't work in the modern era. Okay, because the thinking is it's either this or that is true. Okay, it's true or it's false. And with that thinking, well, you can't deal with big bangs, you can't deal with black holes, you can't deal with antimatter. And let's face it, you can't deal with light because light is either a photon or a wave or both or neither. It's not one thing, okay? It's not spirit and it's not matter. And so the term, once you resort to this kind of thinking of chemistry versus mysticism, basically, you can't describe light like that. So if we're to progress, we need a more integral understanding of life processes. And we don't actually have to reinvent the wheel, by the way. I decided... How's time? Yeah. I won't go there, but what I'd recommend to you is Ken Wilber and his band of merry men, okay? Done a huge amount of work in integral theory, which is simply the ability to see things from all perspectives without making one perspective the truth and getting egoically attached to one perspective. So you can have all options on the table. You can have chemistry and you can have spirit, and they all are true when you look from that point of view, but all truths are partial truth. That's where we're going, I believe. So, just to get back on the ground. This is a summary of what Fritz Albert Popp discovered. Okay, photons are the currency of life. We absorb them from foodstuffs and through the skin and through the eyes, of course. When light shone upon a cell, the photons are stored in the DNA and later re-emitted as organised signals, as biophotons. All living tissue emits light across a wide frequency spectrum, from infrared to UV at least. Our biophotons are coherent. They're energy with information content, and so they're a medium for cellular communication. So biophotons initiate cellular reactions. They regulate chemical reactions, making 100,000 chemical reactions a second possible. By the way, I did the maths on that, and Dr. Carl says there are 37.2 billion cells in the average human, and so you multiply that by 100,000 and you come up with 37 and 15 zeros on the end. Now, while I count 1, 2, 3, that's the amount of chemical reactions that have gone on in your body. How is that even possible? Really? What are we? Neil Finn says people are like suns. And yes, I think so. Okay, so biophotons also initiate biological rhythms, repeating same patterns in cycles. The health of a human can be determined by the quality of the light they're emitting. In health, there's a high level of coherence. The light's very organised and regular. In ill health, there's a state of incoherence where the light waves are out of sync. Biophoton emissions are present in intracellular, intercellular and interspecies communication. That's Fritz Albert Popp's model in a nutshell as I understand it. Okay? He says the implications are immense. So, to me, it's quite awesome to think about it from that level, that angle, shall we say, perspective. We're looking at an incredibly sophisticated communication system. In fact, it's much more sophisticated than the human mind. So when we approach a client, we're locking into, with light, we're locking into a communication system, and it knows more than we do. It knows what's needed. We don't. You know what I mean? So this is the difference in emphasis. Okay, so suddenly we're communicating, we're not directing process. Now, if you wind back the clock to the mechanistic view of life, and there are many interventions that are still like this, the interventions are forceful. You're trying to tell the biosystem what it ought to do. So a vertebral manipulation, right, is a forceful intervention, as is taking the same vitamin every day. Okay, because it's not a communication because you don't know, you're not getting the feedback, you're not measuring results. As is staying on the same drug every day because you have a chronic condition. Okay, so these are all mechanistic interventions. Now, I'm not making that wrong, by the way, because sometimes it works, and in my clinical experience at least, it works very well in combination. So this is Ken Wilber again. Okay, so we need a model that transcends and includes the previous model. So you don't ditch one level of understanding because you've reached a new level of understanding, you incorporate it. So chemistry is no less valid, it's just we have this additional strand that we're working on now. Additional access. And in biophoton work, less is more, because you're really just initiating an impulse. You don't have to keep telling it, you know what I mean? And you know when someone keeps telling you something, you switch off in a very short period of time, and your cellular biology is just the same, okay? Got the message, thanks, blue light, yeah? And we're using actively constructive and destructive interference. So we're amplifying some messages, we're turning off others. Every acupuncturist does that every day, okay? You're energising or you're sedating. So, we're part of a revolution in understanding when we start to work with light. But you won't necessarily get a sympathetic audience. In fact, again, by Ken Wilber's estimation, you need an integral understanding. That's something in 5 to 10% of the population who can look at a problem and not get egoically attached to one point of view. Something like 5 to 10%. Luckily, people a tier, let's call it below in Ken Wilber terms, will also like this sort of thing. This is the greens, okay, the people who are inclusive, and so actually you've got 25% of the population to work with. There's the good news, okay? Don't be discouraged, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Would you like to ask some questions? Are there any questions?
I'm willing to try. Yes.
I've been reading a bit about water and the way water can structure as well.
Yep.
So how do we know that it's the light and not the water that's creating, transmitting the information through the cells?
I would say, and this is just me, okay, and I'm not a scientist, but if you Google elements necessary for life on planet Earth, you'll find that water is one of them and light is another. Okay, and that the equation of life consists of both. And so it's not one or the other, it's how they combine.
We have information from Gerald Pollack,
Yeah.
the fourth stage of water, where it's a kind of a gel stage, and it actually is structured differently.
Yeah.
And it's where all this messaging goes through under the influence of infrared.
Under the...
Infrared.
Right, yeah. So,
actually, the red blood cells has been stated to be the carrier to the cells.
yes.
And I think the water is the communicator from the external.
Okay.
How things are happening.
So,
It was the photosynthesis uses the same porphyrin ring combination as the hemoglobin.
yep.
The only difference is one's got magnesium,
Yep.
one's got iron.
Nice, yeah. So you're saying hemoglobin is human chlorophyll, sort of.
Yeah, it's the little
Yeah.
candle that goes
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah. So we're talking about levels of control of the system, aren't we? There's the light level, there's the chemical level, and they're all valid. Okay, they're all good perspectives. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the Wainwright research where they're using a dye and
Yeah.
next to the light. There is a dental technology that is available,
Yeah.
and I've experienced it where they do use the blue dye inside the tooth and they shine very intense red photon LED, and the studies that I've read shows that it destroys 99.9% of all bacteria.
Cool, yeah.
Do you know whether this researcher has developed a prototype device for use in other parts of the body where there's infection?
I don't, but you can look him up on the site and you'll probably be able to contact him. Just a quick tip. Discovered long ago that if you take a colour puncture torch with a green light and you stick it on a toothache's gone in a few moments, couple of minutes, a minute less, 30 seconds. And so, yeah, light kills bacteria by creating reactive oxygen. I guess that's all we can say confidently. Yeah. I would like to add a little bit to the Wainwright controversy, just for the fun of it. He says the limitation is systemic infection, and how do you treat that? I've treated it for years when you treat the spleen, the thymus, the retromolar lymph. It works with light very, very well. So.
About that, how specifically, what techniques, what light techniques do you use?
For treating an infection?
Well, in your practice.
Okay, well, I use a pendulum. So I listen for what feels like a resonant frequency with someone, and so the green and the red spectrum, infragreen and ultragreen, are two, they're yin and yang, they're two ends of the same imbalance, and you have to pick out where the imbalance is. So I wouldn't say that this one colour works at all times on this point. I'd say get a picture of the overall system. Is that too vague?
I was actually, yes.
Darn.
I was because there are many emerging light technologies which are wonderful. I work with one or two of them on the purely technological part of working with light.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of them all, and that's why I love coming to conferences like this. What light technologies do you employ? It might be all that you employ, but of those technologies.
So you're saying if I have someone walk in with an acute infection? Just generally. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I thought I'd mention that. Okay.
One of these.
Look, I use low-level laser for some things. I use colour puncher for a lot of things. My colour puncher kit is loved to death now. I use spectrochrome. That work that got so banned and maligned, and it's brilliant. It works really quickly. I use gemstones because I'm out there. Do you know what I mean? And I find it works, and I can measure the results on people's blood tests. I use Vogel wands, where there are subtler issues that are really to do with a person's relationship with being alive, you might say, the balancer. And so, but it's all along the lines of symmetry creates health, coherence creates health. So it's whatever it takes to pick up an incoherent kind of vibrational disharmony, and that'll bring it back in tune. Well, I'm sure we're working with time pressures, so thank you very much.